By this point, there's a pretty long history of robots appearing in, well, everything. It's not even limited to strictly sci-fi stories anymore. Sentient and autonomous machines have become a staple of fiction in general. Except for fantasy. It would be pretty weird if they were a staple of fantasy. Actually, no, that's a lie. I would love to see a robot Balrog, okay? That would rule. But what's interesting about the use of robots throughout the history of fiction is how they've evolved over time, and moreover, how their impact on the themes of a story have evolved as well. Robots used to be these scary, completely impossible pieces of machinery that did what they were told, but either because we've gotten closer to actually creating robots, or just because humans have become more introspective, robots have begun to take on a new meaning. It's not uncommon to see a piece of fiction use these walking piles of machinery to pose a very serious and complex question. What is humanity? And oftentimes there isn't an easy answer. Something so deep and philosophical could probably never have a real answer to it. But using non-human characters, especially those like robots, to study the concept of humanity from a non-human angle is something that's only become more prevalent and more important as time has gone on. And it's this idea that drives Robotrio. So, to recap, Robotrio is a web series and audio drama about 3 robots. Ace, the hard-hitting detective created by Thomas Edison IV, Dant, the agriculture and lecture bot, and Casterly's, the good-natured one with a dark past. Each of these 3 characters has their own personal journey throughout the series, undergoing powerful and moving character arcs that allow them to embrace some aspect of humanity. And I think it's in these 3 characters that Robotrio explores the true definition of the term. So before I start what'll inevitably be a long-winded and overly pretentious analysis, I feel like I should preface something. I do know the creators of Robotrio, specifically Lei Valtapaz and Kogan Productions. In fact, I've been talking with Lei about this video since before I even started this script, which is why I feel that it's important to clarify. This is just my analysis of the series based on what I got from it. I haven't spoken to anyone involved with the project about the intended themes or character arcs, meaning this is an entirely subjective and personal analysis, and this could be not at all what was intended from the series. Normally, that would go without saying, but considering the circumstances, it felt like it was worth mentioning. Also, a couple of other notes. Firstly, this video contains major spoilers for Season 1, so go watch it first. Except, second, despite this more fun, cartoony art style the series has, it is not intended for children, and involves some insanely intense elements, so be careful while watching it, and don't let your kids watch this one. I don't want to be responsible for that. Cool? Cool. So here's the deal. In middle school, I hung out at the library a lot, but the point is the library had this one book on writing fiction. I don't remember much about it or even what it was called, but I do remember a really great analysis of the best way to write a trio of characters, by breaking them up into 3 archetypes called the animal, the robot, and the child. The animal is emotional, aggressive, and oftentimes lacks the impulse control of the other 2. Sometimes they'll have an arc relating to that emotion, but ultimately all that matters is that they have those character traits. The robot, on the other hand, is logical, analytical, and more reserved, sometimes to a fault. Sometimes they help dump exposition, sometimes they struggle to connect with other people, but usually their role is to balance out the animal and the child. Speaking of, the child is the most innocent one of the group, usually filled by an actual child or a fish out of water type character, making them a very easy audience stand-in. The child might struggle to understand the world around them, and as such, it's not unusual for their arc to revolve around finding their identity or place in the world. And intentional or not, these archetypes work really well for our robotic trio, and I think it's through these archetypes that we can start to understand these characters and what they say about humanity, starting with right up front, I should probably admit my bias. Ace McNacho, Private Detective Bot, is my favorite character. And no, it's not just because he started out as an Atomic Robo OC, although that may or may not have helped. I mean, have you seen my Atomic Robo collection? But more so, it stems from just how much personality and how much more development he gets throughout the season. Ace is a sarcastic, arrogant know-it-all that's fully capable of dunking on someone and making himself look good in the same sentence. But he's also someone that struggles to open up to those around him and has a hard time wrangling with his emotions. Heck, it's not even that he struggles to open up to those around him, it's that he's often actually antagonistic towards them. But over the course of the season, we see him learn to grieve, overcome his fears, and genuinely connect with people like Castor and Dan. I think it certainly helps that the show spends so much time with him, giving him 2 substantial character arc episodes as well as sprinkling in plenty of development throughout the rest of the season. His first scene in the show proper, not including the Spotlight prequel, introduces him as an incredibly intelligent, if very arrogant person that knows what he's talking about and knows that he knows what he's talking about. He even initially gets involved in Castor's issues not because he wants to help, but because he thinks it would make for an interesting case. And over the course of the series, we see him struggle with the responsibility of sharing his home with people he isn't connecting with, all the while trying to grapple with his own emotions. When his co-creator and surrogate mother dies, we see how much that impacts him. He clearly cares, but he doesn't want to admit that he cares to anyone else or himself. And it takes a much needed breakdown in order to let his friends in. And this is a real turning point for Ace. After this, he starts taking a much more serious look at Castor's issues and really seems to want to solve them. And eventually, that connection means that when faced with one of his biggest fears in the finale, it's his friends that end up helping him snap out of it. And all this is ignoring the additional development we get through flashbacks, where we see Ace's early days as a very robotic android. No personality, no concept of beauty, just a machine. This is a stark comparison to the emotional, short-tempered know-it-all we see in the present day. He's developed a lot over time, and there's still so much we don't know. Things like his full relationship with Sydney Blake, his co-creator, as well as the origins of his fear of rust, and more. I also think it's important to point out that it's not a fine line between robot Ace and human Ace, although in this case we're using human metaphorically, obviously. It's a gradient of development, and we aren't even at the end of that gradient yet. We still see him experiencing human emotions like grief and panic for the first time and making connections throughout the show, and we'll likely see him continue to develop in further seasons. I mean, there's still plenty of unexplored issues with his father that I'm sure we'll see more of in season 2. So all this to say, Ace is a short-tempered, egotistical bot who learns to grieve, face his fears, and drop his ego in order to connect with the people around him. So what does Ace tell us about humanity? Well, humanity allows us to comprehend extremely strong emotions, especially in reaction to life-altering events. Humanity also allows us to comprehend, analyze, and face up to things we are afraid of, that fear being in and of itself a reflection of humanity too. And finally, humanity makes us dependent on others, whether that's having to admit your failings and ask for help, or even just coming to them for emotional support. That connection to other people is entirely essential to how humanity functions. But of course, Ace is only one of 3 main characters. We've covered the animal archetype, but now we need to focus on Dan 1C is probably the simplest to analyze. He gets the least development throughout the series, but he makes up for it by having a certain level of subtlety to his character. On the surface, he's by far the most robotic of the 3. His voice is stilted and mechanical. He was programmed for a specific purpose that he fulfills perfectly, and he's only capable of seeing beauty in comparison to human standards. But if you look beyond the machine, you start to see a kind, empathetic person who always tries to find the positives in life and who strives to help his friends find the same. I think one of the best examples of this comes in episode 1, when Castor arrives scared out of his mind after being confronted by death. Dan's idea of a distraction to help calm him down is to present a panel on agriculture. Not exactly riveting, and it doesn't even really seem to help Castor all that much, but at the same time, he clearly cares for Castor and connects with him enough to understand how stressed he is, and he wants to help him. And that sort of thing happens a lot in the series. He is always willing to help out, he's more than capable of showing a wide array of emotions, and is still fully sentient. In a weird way, I think the closest comparison I can make is to Emmett from the Lego Movie. Both of them start out as seemingly generic, bland people with little to no personality, as Emmett's co-workers call him nothing. Yet over the course of the story, we see more and more that just under the surface, both of these characters are sweet, empathetic people who see the best in others and wholly believe that they're stronger together. And in a weird way, because of that, Dan doesn't have an arc. We do. We're the ones that learn from Dan's actions, just like Castor, Ace, and everyone else in the series. Basically, what I'm saying is that Dant is a sweet cinnamon roll and I love him. But that begs the question, if Dant doesn't really have a character arc, what can we learn from him about humanity? Plenty, in fact. Dant 1C shows us the inherent kindness, empathy, and hope associated with the strength in humanity, especially when that hope is applied towards people working together. Dant makes it clear that humanity is at its best when we support each other, show genuine compassion for one another, and empathize with each other's issues, working together to solve them. And so we have the robot. But that just leaves... Castellese, or Castor, or Cast is the very core of the series, and I'm not just talking about from a plot perspective, although that's certainly true too. After all, it's his mysterious past that sets the entire story in motion. But I also think his literal humanity is what gives him an edge and makes him so complex in more than one way. Because not only are his feelings more natural as a byproduct of not actually being robotic, but there's also his feelings about having such natural feelings that adds another layer on top of that. His ability to dream, his reaction to his ability to dream, and especially what he actually dreams about, all serve as clear examples of who he is and what makes him special. Because throughout the series, it's made clear that Cass struggles to figure out what he actually is. He knows he's unusual, but he doesn't know how, and it scares him. Like an actual child, he doesn't understand his place in the world, almost as much as he doesn't understand the world itself. And even more, he doesn't understand who he is. He hasn't found his own identity yet. All the while, people keep placing all these expectations of what he's supposed to be on him, trying to control what he is and how he fits into the world around him. His father sees him as a son, sure, but more so as a science project, a potential future for human beings. Adelpha, his aunt, sees him as a scared, traumatized kid who needs protection from the real world and from himself. Which is why it's so important that at the end of the season, he finally determines his own identity. He doesn't go back to being Castor, and he certainly doesn't remain as Castellese. Those are identities that have been placed upon him by people other than himself. No, instead he chooses to just be Cast, and finally begins to determine his own place in the world. I think it was an important decision to not give Cast his memories back at the end of the season. He knows who he was, but he isn't that anymore. It makes a very clear divide between Castor and someone entirely new. Someone that can choose for himself what he really is without being bogged down by his past identity. And who knows, maybe Season 2 will give him his memories back anyway, but at that point it won't matter anymore. He'll have been allowed to decide who he is for himself without the need for those memories, and getting them at any point afterwards won't influence that decision. Cast is no longer a child. He doesn't need protection or guidance anymore. He's found his own identity, and for the first time, it's one that he can be proud of. I also think it's worth noting who actually helped him get to that point. It wasn't his father or aunt or one of the many repair people in this show. In fact, it wasn't a human at all. It was Ace and Dant, the two other robots who have more humanity than any of the actual humans in this show. And they helped Cast, the nexus between man and machine, relearn his humanity too. So, what can we learn from Cast? Simple. Humanity allows oneself to understand the world around them and determine their own identity within it, and humanity allows them to overcome trauma and identity crises in order to achieve great things. And there we have it, our three robots, our three archetypes, our three protagonists. It's in them that we learn what it means to be human, and it's in them that we learn about grief and fear and compassion and empathy and identity and trauma and above all, unity. Humanity is a grab bag of all sorts of aspects, ideologies, emotions, and personal conflicts. But as we see in this show, the one constant above all others is unity. When each of these characters tries to handle things on their own, they stumble and suffer. But when they work together and actually help each other, they become capable of amazing things. And ultimately, beyond all of the other undeniably important things this show tries to say, that's the most powerful. Humanity is the ability to connect to, empathize with, and help others. And we don't learn about that humanity through actual humans, we learn about it through machines. Their unity is what makes them truly human, because after all, they are a